This is our reference photo. It's the now demolished former customs house in Toronto, Canada. And it has that typical civic architecture which is grand to the point of being pompous. So I want to capture that sense of flamboyant architecture, but also the solid box-like sense and presence that the building has. Now the challenge is going to be there are lots of vertical alignments that I need to try and keep tight. There's also quite tight foreshortening along this side, and probably the most important thing will be to get these perspective angles correct because they are such a visually dominant part of the building from this angle. And if you're interested, at the end of the video I'll show you the result of the first 17 minutes of my drawing, at which point I decided it wasn't worth continuing the drawing with some of the errors that I'd made. A building such as this, there are always going to be things that aren't quite right. But sometimes, particularly early in a drawing, we realize we just don't have the foundation to continue. So if you're interested to see what sort of errors I made and why I thought they were sufficient to abandon the drawing and start again, then either zip to the end or preferably watch the video and stay tuned when you get there. I'm going to start with this section here because it's the most straightforward to draw, and then I've decided to go to the left, partly because drawing from left to right is easier for a right-handed person, but partly because I want to establish these perspective lines and then to be able to use them to get a sense of how the ones on the other side of the building go. Let's start. As I said, I start with this corner of the building because it provides me a front-on view of 3 rectangular segments, which is probably the easiest place to draw fairly accurately and in proportion. And then from the corners, I can actually start to work out those perspective angles, measuring the lines on the reference with my pen and then transferring that angle back across to my paper. But while I do it that way, I still look to see then what that angle is. And if I don't think it's quite right, I'll check it again. And I'll keep hopefully checking it until I'm confident that it's right. And even then, when I'm drawing, if it looks different, I'll check it again. But I work on this section here. Now, there are 5 divisions between the windows to put in and to get the various foreshortenings and to allow space to put some of the detail of these deeply inset windows. Deeply inset windows are good to try and capture because that represents thick walls, which is part of the opulence of the building, that it has these massive thick walls. Now we have all these crenellations coming out with the entablature there, which are tricky to draw in detail, and so my strategy is to suggest the detail rather than to draw it in detail. So now I'll go upwards rather than downwards, and the important thing here is to keep these straight lines looking straight as we go from one story to another. But all the lines I've drawn at the moment on this story can be changed. The important thing is to get the perspective angles correct because they will be the noticeable thing. Whether they line up and fit with each other will be more significant to if the building looks right than if ornamentation or some of the detail of the windows isn't quite right. I finish this front corner and then I decide I'll get this upper cornice done. And while it's almost a straight line, there are again parts that protrude slightly that reflect the architectural elements on the facade of the building. And so again, the trick is to get the effect of that without having to get bogged down in the detail, to give a sense that there's some minor variation in that line. Notice the order I do things. I do the same thing all the way along the perspective angle because that lets me just keep the perspective angle the most important focus in my mind, that whatever I'm doing, it goes all the way along at the correct angle. And with the building with so much detail on the side, we can actually draw in these perspective angles and know that they're going to be covered by the end of the drawing. So now I do the ground level floor, and the ground does slope down away down this side street, so there needs to be some allowance for that. On this level there is less decoration. And we have these large stone blocks well defined. by the way the building's been constructed in this lower section as well. So I need to reflect that because visually that's an important part of the building, but I don't want to get drawn in with my drawing style to making an exact copy and having to be counting everything and have it correct. So I'm trying to do a fairly loose interpretation that goes with the relatively loose line work that I do. Because I do this freehand and I'm not using a ruler, there's going to be a certain lively quality to my line work, and I want to take advantage of that in how I then do the detail as well as the straight lines. So again, I follow the perspective angles along. We're pretty close to eye level. Eye level is just at the bottom of these windows, and so that's a straight line. So the angles aren't as great down here as they have been in the upper two levels. Although this cornice that's just above ground level probably is a little bit too straight. I should slope that slightly more downwards towards the left side. But I don't think it affects the overall impact of the building. And now I'll start to define the roof and get this roof line in so that basically I've got the left side of the building done before I then move to the front facade. So these little dormer windows, again, the important thing is to draw the suggestion of what the shapes are, and that's often done by shadow as much as line, not to try to draw the detail too exactly, because that will just... So if this is proving helpful, why not hit subscribe and notifications to help you continue on your drawing journey. Let's get back to the drawing. Now I'm working on the upper part of the portico. There's some decorative urns. There is also a sculpture of the British coat of arms, which I need to allow room for. But I decided to do the wall behind it first. Again, I'm paying attention to the perspective angles, but as well as looking at the angles I've drawn on the paper, I'm also just stepping back now and looking at what looks right in my drawing as well. And I get that coat of arms done in the front. It's important again to try and suggest the detail without going into the detail. There's not room to start drawing a unicorn or a line. We just want to suggest shapes and particularly capture any shadows that might be there. And then we need the lower part of the portico to do again, trying to get these angles correct, always going back and checking them with the reference, not just with my drawing. Now I'm drawing the far right hand side. Now, because the portico comes out quite a lot, we actually don't see very much of this at all with this perspective angle, which is kind of nice at this stage because it speeds things along. Now the other top corner of the building, just getting that done and that last window in. It's more straightforward now because in lots of ways I'm just finishing the puzzle. But this part on the top actually ends up being my downfall in some ways with this. We've got this round window. It actually looks like it's just a space in a wall, but actually there is glass behind it and we don't see into it, which is why we don't see the roof line behind it. So this made me stop and pay attention because architecturally it was quite new, and so I wasn't prepared for it by anything I'd drawn already. But the problem was this curved pediment on top. I just didn't pay attention, and when I drew it, I didn't get the perspective right. I put the center of it far too much to the right, which makes it look lopsided or falling forward. There wasn't really anywhere I could go with that to correct it, so in the end I just left it. There is a tower from further behind that comes up, but it doesn't really disguise the lump. I'm in the home stretch now with the line work. I do the decorative railing around the top of the roof line. Again, I'm not trying to copy the actual pattern of the wrought iron. I'm just wanting to suggest that there's some sort of repetitive wrought iron pattern there. Then I do this chimney, which I almost forgot about. So again, I'm just trying to suggest the detail rather than draw it. And there's the top of a little tower that sticks up from, I don't even know whether it's part of this building or a building further behind, but I decided to put it in hoping it will draw attention away from my lumpy pediment, but I don't think so. Then I decide to do the building that's at the back of the customs house, just because it gives a sense of this is in a street rather than standing by itself. I'm using a 0.3mm pen for all of this. I do a little more work on this front corner and decide to put, there's two figures who are sitting on a railing that's in front of the building where the building drops below ground level. And I think these two small figures will add a nice sense of scale, so I do put them in. And now it's a case of starting with the tone. I start with I think it's an N1 Copic marker, the second lightest, and just do this left-hand wall. I don't want it to become overwhelming, the dark, and I know I'm going to add darker tones to it, but I think this is a good starting point because it's always easier to read tone with other tone, values with other values. And so something, whether a tone is dark or light, whether a value is dark or light or mid, really depends on what it's next to as to how it's going to look. But I certainly don't want to go as dark as the effect that we get in the picture here. I find the best approach is really to cover it with a mid-tone or a mid-value as quickly as possible, except for areas that are obviously going to be lighter than that. And then to push some of the darkest areas in the direction we think they're going to go, but also paying attention to local colour. So I put some tone on the roof to reflect the fact that it's a different colour to the wall, and while in this light it doesn't particularly look a different colour, in real life it would have a slightly darker tone to it. So the tone is a particularly great way now to punch those windows deep into the walls. And here is the completed customs house with our reference. Apologies that you couldn't see the reference completely through the video. So what am I thinking? I find it's always helpful to critique a drawing once I've done to give myself a sense of direction for the next one. I've got three things I'm thinking at the moment. One is this lumpy pediment. So the next time I have a curved pediment to draw, I'm going to visualize it a lot more carefully. I'm not happy with this perspective angle. It's not right. In fact, that perspective line's okay, but that one also should angle down. And that does look like it would sit better. And that looks as though it would sit better. So by having this line too high and by having this line too high, in effect I've made this center section appear narrower because I've made this one wider and this one wider. And now that I see it, I can't unsee it. And I think my roof line here is a bit too high. This line here should be just down a little bit at one end and maybe even up slightly, very slightly at the other. It's not that I think this is a bad drawing, but it's so helpful when we have finished a drawing to look critically at it so that we can give ourselves a helpful focus for our next drawing, because we tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. And doing this lets us focus on those mistakes until we stop making them. So what was the mistake I made that made me restart this drawing in the first place, which was why the alignment got all out of place? My first mistake was I started drawing with a 0.5mm pen, which was just too thick. And so what I ended up with was this great blobbing of lines. And when I was coming down here, I'd failed to define what was happening at the base of these pilasters. And so I'd stopped all the windows too high in both of these floors, which changed the visual proportioning of the wall too much, I felt. Plus, my attempts to repair it when I realized what I'd done were just looking blotchy in a way that I didn't think I could recover from or cover, particularly with this heavy pen. So it was 17 minutes I put down to self-education and I started again. And did not have the same problem here because I'd worked out what the problem was and drew this in a way to capture more accurately the repeated architectural elements being foreshortened in the lower parts of each of these stories. This is not an easy drawing to do, but I've put a copy of it on my community page, so if you want to have a go, why not? Good luck with it. I'll see you next time. Bye.